I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, JBS's continuing coverage of the Iran nuclear deal. There is no issue in the Jewish world today, in the world today, more important than the challenges surrounding the Iran nuclear accord, an agreement made between the P5+1, which is made up of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, the United States, Great Britain, France, Russia, and China, plus Germany, the P5+1, and the Islamic Republic of Iran. In 2006, some 9 years ago, the P5+1 joined together in an effort to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, and the United Nations Security Council adopted a series of resolutions demanding that Iran halt its uranium enrichment activities. Gradually, the Security Council began imposing sanctions on those involved in Iran's nuclear and missile programs. Then in 2010, the Security Council expanded its sanctions on the grounds that Iran was continuing to enrich uranium. In 2013, talks, negotiations with Iran and the P5+1 formally began, and an interim agreement was agreed to in Geneva on November 24th, 2013. And after a series of deadline extensions and what seemed to be a 12th-hour deal, on July 14th of this year, President Obama announced that a deal had been agreed to with the Islamic Republic of Iran. Since that time, it's been a mountain of controversy. Clearly, undisputedly, the United States, as part of the P5+1, took some major steps backward from its original goal. The original goal was clear and unambiguous. The goal was to force Iran to dismantle its nuclear weapons program. This included destroying its enriched uranium, prohibiting Iran from enriching uranium in the future. It also included a draconian inspection and verification process that would permit the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, the right to inspect, quote, anywhere at any time, unquote. And the original goal included Iran stopping the building of intercontinental ballistic missiles, which of course have only one purpose: the delivery of warheads, usually nuclear. These were the initial stated goals of the United States of America when the American administration entered talks with Iran. The deal announced by President Obama on July 14th included none of these demands, which is what has sparked the enormous controversy over the Iran nuclear accord. Now, Congress, the Senate, and the House are faced with the decision of whether to approve or disapprove of the Iran deal. As I'm sure you know, if a majority in both the Senate and the House vote to block the deal, President Obama has promised to veto their decision, and both the House and the Senate would need a 2/3 vote to override that presidential veto. This means that the Iran deal will be approved if just 1/3 plus one member of each chamber of Congress, Senate and House, vote for the deal. Just 1/3 plus one. And most experts argue that there will never be enough Democrats who will vote to override the veto to defeat that presidential veto. Of course, there are those in the Jewish world, on the American scene in general as well, who argue that the Iran deal poses such a threat to the stability and security of the world and offers Iran not simply the opportunity to acquire a nuclear weapon, but the economic and military strength to win it international stature and become a major power in both its region and in the world, that this larger threat makes it imperative that the Iran deal be fought to the last moment, even if there is only a slim chance of its defeat. But do we fully understand what the fight in Congress is all about? For some expert analysis, I am most pleased to have on our JBS phones from Washington, D.C. right now, an individual who brings unusual clarity and insight to the most complicated set of issues relating to the Iran deal, and who's written a superb piece about what options now exist for Congress. Robert Satloff, Executive Director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Robert, thank you so much for joining us again.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Happy to join this telephone call.
Good. So again, you wrote a fascinating piece addressing a number of key issues related to the current fight in Congress, and I'm going to ask you to speak about them in one moment. First, I just want to know whether you would want to amend anything you heard me say in my introduction.
Well, I thought you did an excellent introduction. Just to underscore, it's 1/3 plus one of either House of Congress is all it takes to approve the deal.
Thank you.
But otherwise, I thought you did a very fine introduction.
Okay. So, Robert, is the Iran nuclear accord a treaty which needs congressional approval, or is it some other kind of document?
Well, we use the term agreement and accord, but in this case, these are very loosely used terms because none of them apply. Nothing is signed. This is certainly not a treaty, and it's not even an agreement in the sense that the parties sat around a table and signed a document. Nothing is signed. The understandings are really nothing more than that. They are voluntary understandings entered into by the 8 parties to the negotiations. Namely, as you mentioned, the P5 plus 1, those 6 countries, plus the European Union, which counts as its own independent party, and Iran. So these 8 parties entered into a set of understandings that are profoundly political. This is a political agreement. There are technical aspects to it, but at its core, this agreement is nothing more than a political set of understandings to which the parties are bound only by their interests in sustaining these understandings. There is no legal aspect to this. There is no overarching or fundamental legal framework here. It is a set of political understandings. Now,
so, Robert, you make it sound like it's sort of an informal agreement of parties around the table. Is this usual? Have there been other agreements of this nature in the past that you can cite?
Well, this is a highly unusual circumstance. It's unusual compared, for example, to other arms control negotiations. I mean, we tend to think, for example, of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty or the Strategic Arms Limitations talks, which led to treaties with the Soviet Union. Those were treaties that were formal documents with signing ceremonies, over which the Senate of the United States, under our Constitution, has the constitutional responsibility, not just authority, but responsibility to advise and consent. In this case, all bets are off. Congress saw that this was coming down the pike, so they tried to create a different and new form of review and oversight, which resulted in this legislation, the Corker-Cardin legislation, the Iran Review Act, which led to the situation you described, whereby it's not the 2/3 of the Senate that is needed for approval, which is the normal situation with the treaty, but it is only 1/3 of either the House or the Senate which will reach approval of this agreement.
Yes. Is this equivalent to an executive order which the president has a right to enter into on his own, and which the Supreme Court has said in matters of diplomacy with foreign nations, Congress does not have a right to interfere?
Well, it's the functional equivalent of an executive agreement, except, of course, there's no agreement. It's more like an executive promise. What separates this from other executive agreements is that there is a law that the president signed that does provide for congressional review. So the president may, in the future, decide to contest that law. It wouldn't be the first time this or other presidents contested laws in which they themselves signed. But he did sign a law which gave Congress authority to review and then to vote resolutions either of approval or disapproval.
So everything about this, Robert, seems very both informal and murky. Is that fair to say?
Well, I think there's quite a bit of murkiness. Some of the informality was removed when the Obama administration, immediately took the agreement and went to the United Nations and had the Security Council vote to endorse the agreement in a Security Council resolutions. Security Council resolutions have the force of international law to them. In this case, there's a wrinkle in that the Security Council resolution doesn't come into effect until after Congress is supposed to have voted its resolution of approval or disapproval on the agreement. So the resolution has no effect today, but it will have effect before too long.
Okay. What right at all, then, Robert, does Congress have to be involved in this process and to say yes or no on the Iran deal?
Well, there is a law, the law of the land, passed by both houses of Congress and signed by President Obama, which establishes the authority of Congress to review this agreement. It demands all sorts of reporting requirements from the administration about aspects of this agreement, and it gives Congress the right to vote resolutions of approval or disapproval. And the implication under the law of a resolution of disapproval is very specific. A resolution of disapproval does not tear up the agreement. It doesn't restrict the president from entering into these sorts of understandings. It doesn't negate the accord. What the resolution of disapproval would do is it puts a restriction on the president's ability under the law to waive certain sanctions. Just to back up one moment, this is a very arcane and complicated area. There's lots of different types of sanctions. But basically, most sanctions have what is called a presidential waiver authority, where under certain circumstances, the president is allowed to suspend or waive the application of these sanctions. In this case, a vote of disapproval would restrict the president's ability to waive or suspend those sanctions, specifically the nuclear-related sanctions, which is something the United States has committed to do in the event that Iran fulfills its core responsibilities under the agreement.
Okay, I want to make sure people understand what you're saying, and you write about this so beautifully in your piece. What you're saying is, and people don't tend to understand this, Robert, that what the Congress can do, if it could defeat the accord on a first vote and then override any presidential veto, is very narrow. The only thing that a congressional override of a veto would mean was that the president would no longer be able to suspend American-imposed sanctions that relate to Iran's nuclear program. Have I stated it accurately?
That's correct.
Okay. I want now...
Let me just,
please,
if I can, Mark,
please.
Because a key aspect of this is the timeline. Let me just bring your listeners through the timeline for a moment, because most people think that this is an issue that will come to a head the day after some congressional vote.
Yes.
I think that's a wrong reading of the situation. a congressional vote will occur in September, the first round of the vote. If there's an override vote, it would be at the end of September, beginning of October. But under the agreement, the first thing that will happen has nothing to do with the United States. The first thing that happens is Iran has a responsibility to implement its core requirements under the deal. That is mothballing thousands of centrifuges, shrinking its stockpile of enriched uranium, gutting the core of its plutonium reactor, responding to demands about its possible past military dimensions of its nuclear program. These are things that Iran needs to do up front. These will take some months, perhaps 6 to 9 months. It is only after that entire process is completed and after the International Atomic Energy Agency certifies its completion, then does the United States, the United Nations, and the European Union, then do they have their responsibility to fulfill their part of the bargain, namely to lift nuclear-related sanctions.
Okay,
This is an issue that will come into play sometime in mid-2016.
I understand. I want to make sure, though, I understand and the audience understands exactly the way in which you believe this has to play out. You're not saying that any of the sanctions will be lifted until Iran fulfills some of its obligations, which are significant in their behavior, and will take, in your piece you say 6 months, 6 to 9 months for Iran to accomplish. During those 6 to 9 months, all of the sanctions which are currently in place, is this what you're saying? All of the sanctions will be in place, no money, none of the $150 billion that's earmarked to go back to Iran, none of that money will go to Iran. Are you saying that Iran will be, at least in theory, restricted from trading with Russia, China, and the European Union? Are you saying that none of the draconian economic sanctions currently on Iran, which brought Iran to the table, will be lifted for the next 6 to 9 months?
Look, even if the agreement gets approved, sanctions stay in force until Iran implements its requirements. That's the order of the agreement.
How realistic is that,
Iran
Robert?
does what it's supposed to do, then the international community does what it promises.
How realistic do you believe that sequence of events is? Will you be surprised if Iran tries immediately, as some people are arguing it's doing now, that it sent emissaries to the Soviet Union, to former Soviet Union, to negotiate, that China has already made a deal, that Germany is already in the process of making deals with Iran? To what extent do you believe, although the process you describe is in this informal setting, the formal process, to what extent would you be surprised if somehow the process were bent and, in essence, Iran began reaping the benefits of this deal far before 6 to 9 months is concluded and before the world has confirmed Iran's compliance?
Look, I don't think we should be naive. Of course, different countries and different industries and different businesses are going to be chatting up their Iranian counterparts, and if not, they probably already have begun this process. The key is whether significant sums of money begin to change hands, whether contracts are signed that access the international financial community, that access the banking world, from which Iran is now denied access under the sanctions. So the real answer to your question has to do with America's commitment to enforce its sanctions. Mm-hmm. That's the variable here. If America is vigilant in its enforcement of sanctions, including the secondary sanctions that will stay in place because of the non-nuclear sanctions. Those are sanctions that the United States has on Iran for terrorism, human rights, and other issues. If we remain vigilant in our enforcement, then the lion's share of the sanctions regime will stay in place. If we go flaccid in our enforcement, the sanctions regime falls apart.
Okay. If somebody were to say to you, as I listen to you, Robert, you seem to be saying Americans in general and American Jews in particular shouldn't feel so strongly, so passionately about Congress's in some way blocking this deal. If that's what somebody said to you, would you agree that what you're saying is it's not so critical for America to block this deal?
No, that's not the way I approach this. I think it's. I would rather put it this way: if you believe that this deal is excellent, then urge support. If you believe this deal is horrible, then urge opposition. If you believe this deal is fixable, and that there are improvements that can and should be done to it, then those are either going to be done before the congressional vote, or they can be done after the congressional vote. Because the United States is not required to begin to fulfill any responsibilities until sometime in mid-2016.
Yes.
So do not be afraid of a no vote killing the deal. Do not be afraid of a no vote sending off America into war in the Middle East. Do not be afraid of a diplomatic calamity. No, I disagree. I think there is considerable time before a vote and even longer after a vote to improve the agreement.
Yes. One more issue for you that comes out of your piece. There are those who argue in the Jewish community, Robert, that if the deal were killed by Congress in some way, and again, you have now sophisticated what this whole vote means. I really hope people appreciate the insight you've shared with us. But there are those who argue that if the deal is killed in Congress, the result of that killing will be worse for America and for Israel than even this deal, as problematic as it is.
The deal can't be killed in Congress. I know that's a nice sounding phrase with political resonance.
Yes.
But Congress cannot kill the deal. This deal can only be killed if the parties to it want the deal dead. That's point one. The question you're referring to more specifically as the implications of congressional disapproval of the deal. Does that somehow irrevocably impair America's diplomacy? Does that somehow undermine America's standing globally? Will that lead inexorably to war in the Middle East? In my view, the answer is no. Now, there may be, many of your listeners or viewers may still think it's a good deal and deserves their support, a reasonable position. But they shouldn't be afraid of a no vote as the source of this horrible, calamitous situation to America's standing.
Yes. Robert, you are both an analyst on the world scene as it applies to Middle East issues. You're also a committed Jew. As you look at this issue, to what extent are American interests and Israel's interests aligned? To what extent are there different interests here which pull at American Jewry?
Well, this is a difficult question to answer, I have to say. I tend to view these issues through the lens of, what is best for Americans, all 300 and some odd million of us. My own view is I think it's perfectly reasonable for the President of the United States to articulate his view of what's in the best interest of the United States. One can agree with it or disagree with it, but I think that's an eminently reasonable position for any president to take. I find it a bit presumptuous for a president to suggest that he knows better than the democratically elected leader of any other country, that he knows better than that leader what is in the interests of that country. In this case, the elected leader of Israel. It could be the elected leader of any other country. But I just think it's truly presumptuous to suggest that the leader of our country knows better than the leader of another country what's in that other country's best interests.
Mm-hmm.
They can debate it, they can disagree, but to try to convince American citizens that a certain American initiative is really better for a foreign country than that foreign country's own leadership, it just doesn't quite add up in my book.
I do believe that the interests in this issue may not be identical and overlap completely, but that in general, whatever is threatening Israel today is also a threat to the United States, and that American Jews have every right to be against this deal if that's where they stand, because they believe it's bad in the long run for the interests of the United States of America, and they can also feel that it's against the interests and the security and safety of the State of Israel, and that American Jews have every right to participate in the American democratic process for either or both of those reasons. And I wonder if, to what extent that is a position you're comfortable with, or whether you would say it differently.
Well, no, I certainly agree with your final comment. American Jews, like all other Americans, have an important role to play in this process. I found it deeply troubling, the idea that the accusations out there by some of dual loyalties.
Yes.
This issue is not about Israel, although Israel is, of course, a key aspect of it.
Yes.
This issue is about what is right for the United States,
Yes.
and it is disgusting to suggest that an American citizen is somehow beholden to a foreign power because they agree or disagree with the President of the United States on this issue.
Robert Satloff, you continue to do fabulous work for the United States. I hope everyone goes to your website. It's the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Robert Satloff has a piece where he discusses what would it mean for Congress to vote against the Iran Accords. He explains so much that most of us don't understand. I give you enormous credit, Robert. Continue the good work, and you know how much I appreciate the fact that you're always available to come on JBS and share your insight with our viewers. Thank you very, very much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
You be well.
Take care.
Robert Satloff, Executive Director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And again, if you really care about this issue, and it's so easy to think that the matter is black and white. Very few things in life are black and white. The longer this issue goes on and is discussed and is discussed in its intricacies, one understands in the end one has to take a position for or against, but it's not black and white. There are issues that really have to be thought through very carefully. Robert Satloff adds to the discussion, and on JBS, as I've said to you over and over again, we will stay on this issue for as long as it takes and try to give you as much clarification and insight as we possibly can. As always, my thanks to Sloan Copeland, our director, Serge Golub, our production coordinator, the associate director of JBS, Dara Golub, and to the producer of this edition of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.